This is TWiT.
Australia's Telecommunications Assistance and Access Bill.
Yeah, I was wondering what you'd say about this.
Yeah, of 2018. Last Thursday, Australia's House of Representatives has finally passed what is known as formerly the Telecommunications Assistance and Access Bill of 2018, less formally known as the Anti-Encryption Bill. And once Australia's upper house votes the bill into law, which is expected since the bill enjoyed wide bipartisan support, it would go into effect during the next session of Australia's parliament, which occurs in early 2019. So this looks like it's happening. It would provide, and I'll go into this podcast is about interesting details. So I want to cover a little bit of probably what the regular mainstream press doesn't talk about. It would, as we would expect, and we've been talking about this sort of thing happening now for quite a while, provide law enforcement with a legal means, that is, lawful means, to compel anyone using encryption, so Google, Facebook, WhatsApp, Signal, and others, to assist them in accessing the encrypted communications of their products and platforms. So the way this thing is written, they use the term notice in an unusual way, but it takes a form of three so-called notices. There's the TAR, the TAR, which is the Technical Assistance Request. And that's described as a notice to request tech companies for providing voluntary assistance to law enforcement, which includes removing electronic protection, providing technical information, installing software, putting information in a particular format, and facilitating access to devices or services. Okay, so voluntary is like the key word there. That's the Technical Assistance Request. Then there's the TAN, the Technical Assistance Notice, which the bill states is a notice requiring, rather than requesting, technology companies to provide assistance they're capable of providing that is reasonable, proportionate, practical, and technically feasible, giving Australian agencies the flexibility to seek decryption of encrypted communications in circumstances where companies have existing, and that's key, existing means to do it. Like, for example, in the bill it states points where messages are not end-to-end encrypted, meaning either before they have been or after they have been decrypted at the other end. And then the TCN is the so-called Technical Capability Notice, which is issued by the Attorney General requiring companies to, quote, build a new capability, unquote, to decrypt communications for Australian law enforcement. So, we can all read that. Collectively, these so-called notices would compel tech companies to modify their software where modification is necessary, and their service infrastructure to essentially backdoor encrypted communications and data that would otherwise not be obtained. The bill itself I looked at, and it is incomprehensible to a lay, technologist. It is just, I think it was 218 some pages. However, I found a sort of a digest of it, which is more conversational and has some back and forth and breaks these things down. So I want to share a couple things because, for example, Apple was involved in providing feedback. And the industry was invited to provide that feedback, although all of this has been relatively fast-tracked. And it's like as if suddenly there's a great deal of urgency and a lot of the opposition to this, and you can imagine there's plenty from the civil rights people and the and the industry itself that is saying, whoa, hold on, let's not rush into anything. And the other problem we have is that there is, as always seems to be, where legislation bumps into technology, there is ambiguity left in the legislation, which of course ultimately ends up needing resolution in courts when someone says, well, we don't think that's what the bill says, and the people who wrote it say, well, yes, but that's what we meant. And then the people opposing it say, well, then why didn't you say so? Well, the answer, the reason they didn't say so is they know they couldn't have gotten it passed if it had been a lot more explicit. So it's deliberately left in the gray in order to get it through the legislative process and dump it on, at the feet of the courts. So from this really good digest, they said, following earlier industry consultations, the government released an exposure draft, which is what they called it, of the bill on the 14th of August, 2018. Okay, right? So August, September, October, November, December, not a long time ago, and sought public submissions by September 10th. So, whoops, wait a minute. August, September. So sought public submissions within shy of 4 weeks. The Department of Home Affairs in Australia, DOHA, received almost 16,000 submissions, of which over 15,000 were classified as standard campaign responses. So, I guess politically motivated. 743 were described as unique individual responses classified as appropriate for consideration, and 55 were considered substantive submissions from industry groups, civil society, government bodies, and individuals. They wrote, while some stakeholders raised concerns about other schedules. Oh, this thing has, I think it was 4, they called them schedules, which are essentially the meat of the legislation. It's Schedule 1, which is where all of these 3 notices were described. So this says, while some stakeholders raised concerns about other schedules, the majority of submissions focused primarily or exclusively on Schedule 1 of the exposure draft. And that is the so-called industry assistance schedule. They wrote, many stakeholders provided submissions that included general and specific recommendations on the proposed industry assistance scheme, including, and I don't know what these acronyms are, IGIS, AHRC, LCA, and Applied Cryptography Academics. So those must be Australian interest groups of some sort. And Cryptography Academics, Chris Culnane and Vanessa Teague. There was significant concern that the scheme in its current form has very wide application, and that amendments to offer greater definition, narrow the scope, or clarify processes are necessary. From a technology perspective, Apple submitted that Schedule 1, quote, remains dangerously ambiguous with respect to encryption and security, unquote. Further, Apple stated, quote, we encourage the government to stand by their stated intention not to weaken encryption or compel providers to build systemic weaknesses into their products. Due to the breadth, this is still Apple talking, due to the breadth and vagueness of the bill's authorities, the bill could allow the government to order the makers of smart home speakers to install persistent eavesdropping capabilities into a person's home, require a provider to monitor health data of its customers for indications of drug use, or require the development of tools that can unlock a particular user's device, regardless of whether such tool could be used to unlock every other user's device as well. While we share the goal of protecting the public and communities, we believe more work needs to be done on the bill to iron out the ambiguities on encryption and security to ensure that the Australians are protected to the greatest extent possible in the digital world. And none of that happened. So this thing was pushed through and rushed, and the bill as it stood is in the process of being enacted. So for its part, the government argues the new legislation, naturally, we've heard this before in various forms from multiple governments, for national security and an essential tool to help law enforcement and security agencies fight serious offenses such as crime, terrorism, drug trafficking, smuggling, and of course, it's in there, the sexual exploitation of children. Since the bill had support from both major parties, the coalition and the Labor parties, the upper house could vote in support of this assistance and access bill to make it law, which, as I said at the top, is expected to come into effect in early 2019. The bill states that the tech companies cannot be compelled to induce a systemic weakness or systemic backdoor into their legitimate software or hardware, or to remove electronic protection like encryption to satisfy the government demands. So again, here we have this weird collision of non-technical intent and the statement that like what the bill cannot be compelled to cause companies to do, yet they're being compelled to essentially, break encryption in some form or fashion. So, okay. So, who knows how this is going to end up coming out. Instead, the new legislation contains measures aimed at facilitating, this digest says, lawful access to information through two avenues: decryption of encrypted technologies, okay, and access to communications and data at points where they are not encrypted. So I guess somebody has told these legislators that, it's not necessary to decrypt the data if you just get it before it's encrypted or after it's decrypted. So the bill stipulates, quoting from the bill now, quote, "We encourage the government to stand by their stated intention." Oh, I'm sorry, that's what Apple had said before. So we have, as we've said before, this Five Eyes nations and this so-called going dark problem that we've talked about. I looked around at what various technical outlets were having to say about this. One said that since Australia is a member of the Five Eyes Alliance, along with the United States, the UK, Canada, and New Zealand, which last month declared that, quote, "privacy is not an absolute," unquote, and the use of end-to-end encryption, quote, "should be rare," unquote, the new bill could be a stepping stone towards new encryption laws in other nations as well. I mean, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing everything. Well, look at the GDPR. We're seeing everything sort of creeping forward. Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has previously made his position on encryption clear last year, saying that the laws of mathematics are very commendable, but the only law that applies in Australia is the law of Australia. So, Apple at some point responded to the new bill by making their submission to the Australian government, saying that encryption is simply math, and any process that weakens the mathematical models that protect user data for anyone will by extension weaken the protections for everyone. So anyway, I really do think that, this is the interesting thing. I mean, this will be probably the most interesting issue in 2019, given that Intel's processors have now been fully examined and don't have any more disasters waiting for us and surprises. Because, even as we've talked about in the U.S., there is this notion of warrantable examination. That in the U.S., privacy is not an absolute. You need to get a search warrant, in which cases you're able to search under that warrant. And we do have a philosophical collision here between math, which, when properly implemented, as Apple says, is absolute. It can provide absolute encryption that a third party, it's unlike the front door of a house that can be broken into. So anyway, it just looks like this is a battle between governments and the forces that want to protect our privacy, and I expect governments to win.